Following the October Revolution of 1917, the Bolshevik seizure of power led to the Russian Civil War, which continued until 1922. The victory of the Bolshevik Red Army enabled them to set up the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Throughout the Civil War, various religions, secularists and anti-clericalists of the Bolsheviks played a key role in the military and social struggles which occurred during the war. Religious situation before the October Revolution. Since 1721, the Russian Orthodox Church had been the established church of the Russian Empire. The church reforms introduced by Peter I introduced a period of caesaropapism to the ROC. This meant that while the ROC enjoyed substantial privileges, it was nevertheless subordinated to the state. As the intelligentsia became more critical of the Tsarist regime, this was often accompanied by a rejection of the ROC, and sometimes by a rejection of religion in general. Others, such as Leo Tolstoy, retained a strong Christian belief but rejected the autocracy. He was excommunicated by the ROC. Some Bolsheviks, such as Vladimir Bonch-Broyevich, became involved with the religious minorities collectively called the sectarians. Bonch-Broyevich joined Tolstoy and Vladimir Chertkov in supporting the Doukhobors, even sailing with a group of them when they migrated to Canada. In 1914 there were 55,173 Russian Orthodox churches and 29,593 chapels, 112,629 priests and deacons, 550 monasteries and 475 convents, with a total of 95,259 monks and nuns in Russia. Following the Bolshevik seizure of power, 11 days following the storming of the Winter Palace, a council of the Russian Orthodox Church re-established the Patriarchate and elected Metropolitan Tikhon of Moscow as Patriarch. Tikhon refused to take sides in the Civil War, although the official Bolshevik propaganda presented him, as well as the Church, as supporting the Whites. The Bolsheviks used the alleged support of the Russian Orthodox Church for the Whites as the justification for killing clergy in massive numbers. Following the Bolshevik seizure of power, one issue they faced was the removal of the privileged position of the ROC. The Declaration of the Rights of the Peoples of Russia removed special privileges based on faith and nationality. This was soon followed by a decision by Sovnarkom to confiscate all the ROC's monasteries and educational establishments. When the Bolsheviks seized the Holy Synod's printing house, relations between them and the ROC became further strained. One issue was removing Orthodox Christian symbolism from state buildings. However, the Bolsheviks did not prioritize anti-religious campaigning, because they were concerned about how this would affect the popularity of the new regime. Persecution of the Church during the Civil War. During the Russian Civil War, the Red Army massacred large numbers of clergy and believers, often on grounds of alleged support for the Whites. Much of these killings were not officially instigated from the top, but were done on the initiative of local units of soldiers. In later years, the Church would declare that the excommunication was a misunderstanding based on the belief that these killings were officially instigated. However, later Soviet authors would claim central responsibility for these actions, including Yemelyan Yaroslavsky, who justified the campaign by claiming that the Church was fighting against them. Many monasteries were attacked. Holy Mountain Monastery near Kharkov was plundered very early in the Civil War. In a nearby Skety in the village of Gorokova, a monk named Israel was murdered for refusing to hand over the keys to the Skety cellars. In the same area, a religious procession was attacked on its way as it rested the night, and two priests, a deacon, the owner of the cottage where they were staying at, as well as his daughter, were all killed. Metropolitan Metropolitan Vladimir of Kiev was the first bishop killed by the Bolsheviks on January 25, 1918. He had consistently opposed the revolution, and he was severely beaten as well as tortured before being shot outside the monastery of the Caves. Before being shot by his murderers, he prayed to God for them to be forgiven. In the Don region in February 1918, the Reds were killing every priest they could find. An 80-year-old monk priest named Ambrosi was beaten with rifle butts before being killed. A priest named Dmitri was brought to a cemetery and undressed, but when he tried to cross himself before being killed, a soldier chopped off his right arm. An old priest who tried to stop the execution of a peasant was beaten and cut to pieces with swords. In the Holy Saviour Monastery, Red soldiers arrested and killed the 75-year-old abbot by scalping him and beheading him. In the Kherson province, a priest was crucified. In a Cuban Cossack village, an 80-year-old priest was forced to wear women's clothing, brought to the village square and ordered to dance. When he refused, he was hanged. In the Cuban Cossack village of Plotavi, Fr. Yakov Vladimir was targeted by the Chekists for his popularity. They executed him along with wife and one of his sons. Bishop Hermogenes of Tobolsk was killed along with other detainees on the 16th of June 1918 by drowning. He had organized a religious procession the day after the Tsar had come through Tobolsk on the way to Ekaterinburg, in which he blessed the royal family. He was arrested the following week and the Soviets promised to release him for 10,000 rubles, and later 100,000 rubles. When the ransom was collected and submitted, the delegation of notables and clergy that had delivered it were arrested as well. Germajan was reportedly taken on a river steamer. Rocks were attached to his head and he was thrown into the water. In Voronezh, 7 nuns who had prayed for a white victory were reportedly boiled in a cauldron of tar. Archbishop Wakim of Nizhny Novgorod was murdered by Red forces who hanged him head down from the iconostasis above the central royal doors. The clergy in the Crimea suffered terribly. One priest named Uglyansky was killed by Red forces on grounds that he used green ribbons instead of red ribbons on the church icon lamps. Churches in Simferopol, Feodosia and other parts of the Crimea were desecrated and the clergy were brutally murdered. Philosoph Ornaitsky, a priest in Petrograd, was arrested in the spring of 1918 after giving a public requiem for victims of the Bolsheviks. He and 32 others were driven to a cliff overlooking the Gulf of Finland, where the priest was allowed to perform a brief funeral service and bless the victims before they were all shot and dropped into the sea. Archpriest John Vorster in Moscow, a famous Orthodox missionary and church activist, preached against the Bolsheviks, and as a result he was blackmailed by the Bolsheviks, arrested and executed. He was executed along with Roman Catholic priest Lutoslavsky and his brother, 2 Tsarist ministers, and Orthodox Bishop Ephraim, former State Council Chairman Ivan Shiglovitov and Senator S. Beletsky. Fr. Vostokov conducted a short funeral service and preached to his victims to face death as a sacrifice of atonement, after which each victim came forward to be blessed by Fr. Vostokov and the bishop, then they were shot. During the Red occupation of Stavropol Diocese in 1918, the Bolsheviks killed at least 52 Orthodox priests, 4 deacons and 4 lectors. Priest Alexander Podolsky was tortured and killed for giving a Te Deum service for a Cossack regiment before it attacked the Bolsheviks. When a peasant came to collect his body, the peasant was shot dead on the spot. Fr. Alexei Milyatinsky was tortured, scalped and killed for preaching to Red Army soldiers that they were leading Russia to disaster and for offering prayers for the Cossacks. Even left-wing priests could be killed, such as Ivan Prigorsky, who was taken out of church on Holy Saturday into the street, where Red soldiers cursed him, mutilated his face and then killed him. In the Diocese of Perm, during 1918, at least 42 churchmen were murdered. A priest in Perm was killed by the Cheka who cut out his cheeks and eyes, and then paraded him through the streets before he was buried alive. Adronik, the Archbishop of Perm, was arrested immediately after the rite of anathema was performed in his cathedral. He was probably executed sometime shortly after December 1919. As a result of the unusual situation in which the local residents gave the Cheka popular support for these actions, they followed up Adronik's murder with mass killings of Perm's clergy, including Vicar Bishop Ferovan of Solikamsk. A delegation from the All-Russian Church Sober in Moscow went to Perm to investigate what had happened. While returning, however, the train was boarded and they were all shot by Red soldiers. Jakov Svedlov ordered in June 1918 to take hostages from the ranks of industrial entrepreneurs, members of the Liberal and Menshevik parties as well as the clergy. Few of these hostages would survive. In the town of Chorny Yar on the Volga, a lay missionary named Levzed Kunsevich proclaimed the Patriarch's encyclical to a crowd of people. Kunsevich was arrested and publicly shot in July 1918. Bishop Macarius of Vyazma, who was beloved by the local population, was arrested as a result of his popularity in the summer of 1918. He was executed along with 14 others in a field near Smolensk, whom he ministered and attempted to comfort with blessings before their execution. One of the soldiers who executed him afterward confessed on his deathbed that he had killed a saint. Bishop Nikodem of Belgorod condemned acts of violence, plunder and murder in his sermons, and he was arrested by the local Cheka commandant, Salyenko, at Christmas 1918. Resistance from the population in protest to his arrest caused Salyenko to release him and ordered him not to preach those things again. The bishop continued to preach these things, however, and he was arrested again. A priest's wife who went to plead on the bishop's behalf was executed on the spot. The bishop was killed soon after, but they disguised his corpse to make it look like a soldier and threw it into the common graveyard. Between June 1918 and January 1919, in Russia there were killed 1 Metropolitan, 18 bishops, 102 priests, 154 deacons, 94 monks and nuns, and there were imprisoned 4 bishops, and 211 priests. The state sequestered 718 parishes and 15 monasteries. It closed 94 churches and 26 monasteries. It desecrated 14 churches and 9 chapels. It forbade 18 religious processions. It dispersed by force 41 religious processions. And it interrupted church services with insults to religious feelings in 22 cities and 96 villages. On January 14, 1919, in the Estonian university town of Tartu, retreating Red soldiers killed 20 clerics. Among those killed was Bishop Platon of Tallinn, 2 Orthodox priests, a Lutheran pastor and 16 laymen. Bishop Leontius was murdered along with most of the diocesan clergy in 1919 after he made a sermon that quoted Jesus's words, "I was naked and you have clothed me. I was ill and you looked after me," and this quotation was interpreted as an attack against the Bolsheviks. In Kharkov, a priest named Mokovsky was executed for criticizing the Bolsheviks in his sermons. When his wife came to get his body, the Cheka chopped off her limbs, pierced her breasts and killed her. In the village of Popana in the Donetsk coal basin, the priest Dragushinsky was executed for a sermon that was interpreted as an attack on the Reds. A priest named Shangan was murdered and his body was cut in pieces. Archpriest Surtsov was beaten for several days before he was shot and his body was thrown into the Pekara River. In the town of Pekara, an old priest named Rasputin was tied to a telegraph pole, then shot, and then his body was given to dogs to eat. In Saleska Farnasii Smirnov, a psalmist was executed for giving a funeral litany over a dead French soldier. The Bolsheviks closed churches and used them for other purposes. There were accounts of drunken orgies taking place in the desecrated churches. The pretext for these killings was usually alleged support for the enemy, criticism of the Bolsheviks and/or their ideology, or for liberal and/or bourgeois sympathies. Telling people to follow God's laws above what the state directed was also used as a pretext for the killing. The uncertainty of the revolution's success in the early years may also have triggered some paranoia among the Bolsheviks towards groups that they considered threatening. The Orthodox Church must have thought that the Bolsheviks would lose power, because after Tikhonov's election it declared that the Russian Orthodox Church was the national church of Russia, that the state needed church approval to legislate on church matters, that blasphemy should remain illegal, that church schools should be recognized, and that the head of the state as well as the top appointees in education as well as religious affairs should be Orthodox. The Orthodox were the primary target due to their association with the old regime, although other religions were attacked as well. A Polish priest named Krapianiki in 1918 was arrested on the feast of Corpus Christi and scheduled for execution, but the execution was called off after intervention from the Polish government. After the papal protest against the persecution of the Orthodox Church, the regime retaliated by arresting Archbishop Dorop of the Roman Catholic Diocese of Mogilev in April 1919, but he was later released to Poland in exchange for a Polish communist named Radek who had been arrested in Poland. Despite the fact that non-Orthodox religions had been persecuted under Tsarist Russia, leaders of other faith communities gave messages of sympathy to the Orthodox Church during this time. Many of these sects that had been persecuted by the Orthodox state found themselves better prepared for the situation post-1917 than the Orthodox Church. The state initially showed a friendly attitude towards Protestant evangelicals and Muslims, while maintaining some pretense that they were only fighting against the Orthodox hierarchy for its relationship with the Tsar and not against religion generally. The leader of Russia's Protestant evangelicals, Ivan Prokhanov, joined the Bolsheviks in denouncing the Orthodox Church as reactionary. The Mennonite community numbered 110,000 in 1917, and it would emigrate from Russia in massive numbers in the following decade. There were 1.6 million Roman Catholics on the territory of the new state in 1917. There had been over 15 million prior to the war, but after Poland and the Western territories were lost, this number shrunk greatly. Christians outside of Orthodoxy would actually have some benefit of increasing membership in the succeeding years, even while the Orthodox Church declined in membership. In 1900, about 11% of the population were Christians belonging to non-Orthodox groupings, and by 1970 this number had become 31%. Muslims. Many Muslims in the Russian Empire were attracted to the Bolsheviks' anti-imperialist stance, due to the imperialism of Western powers over Muslim nations. The Muslim Socialist Committee of Kazan was established following the February Revolution. Despite the hard anti-religious stance, the Bolsheviks in the years following the revolution and during the Civil War were in a very poor position to fight against Islam in Central Asia. Therefore, the Bolsheviks appealed to them as allies and promised them political independence and religious freedom. Lenin even voiced admiration of Muslims who had fought against imperialism and saw Muslim folk heroes as emblems of the struggle against imperialism. In 1917, the Bolsheviks made this pronouncement to Muslims in Russia: to all toiling Muslims of Russia and the East, whose mosques and prayer houses have been destroyed destroyed, whose beliefs have been trampled on by the czars and the oppressors of Russia. Your beliefs and customs, your national and cultural institutions are declared henceforth free and inviolable. Organize your national life freely and without hindrance. This is your right. Know that your rights are protected by the entire might of the revolution and its organs. Support this revolution and its government. Many Muslims embraced this call and saw this revolution as a means of empowering Islam. An influential group of Central Asian Marxists led by Sultan Ghaliev then took the initiative to try to reform Islam for the modern era, and they were accepted by the state as a buffer between itself and the native population of the Central Asian republics. They promoted atheism in Central Asia, but attempted to give the impression that they were not attempting to fight against any religion. Reaction of the populace. Much of the population were relatively indifferent to the fate of the church. However, some portion of the population stood up in the church's defense, and ensured its continued survival in the face of the onslaught. The power of the church had been declining since the February Revolution. When the February Revolution had made attendance for soldiers its services and acceptance of the sacraments voluntary, both declined from 100% to 10%. Church attendance began to raise itself again after Bolshevik atrocities became more widespread. The populations of some areas protected the churches and clergy, and even to pay for church costs after the state deprived it of any funding. After the elimination of all state support for religion, congregations had to rely entirely upon voluntary donations and voluntary support from the parishioners in order to continue. The Te Deum service was banned, but in some places such services in defiance. Some places, such as the city of Yuzovka, the miners and industrial workers threatened the Bolsheviks with rebellion if they harmed the clergy of the church, and the Bolsheviks took no action as a result. In other places, the people were so afraid of the terror tactics that they remained passive, and even clergymen would give in to obedience to Bolshevik demands. In the major cities, large crowds of laity cooperated and acted critically to save the churches there. In Petrograd in January 1918, Alexander Kollontai, the Bolshevik Commissar for Social Welfare, sent troops to the Alexander Nevsky Monastery to confiscate it for social welfare purposes, and huge crowds of laity came to defend it. The troops opened fire on the crowd, but the laity kept the ground and would not be dispersed. Shortly afterward, a religious procession in Petrograd with Metropolitan Vladimir at its head marched through the city with several 100,000 participants. Leagues of laymen began to form in many cities for the church's defense. In Moscow and Petrograd, 6 to 10% of the population joined these leagues. These leagues took action in preventing the state from taking over monasteries. Between February to May 1918, 687 persons were killed in clashes between these leagues and the government. These leagues were effective in saving the church, partly because the state found it harder to ignore the working masses who constituted these leagues than they did in ignoring the disenfranchised clergy. Nationalization of church property. Lenin's decree on the separation of church and state on January 23, 1918 deprived the formerly official church of its status of legal person, the right to own property or to teach religion in both state and private schools or to any group of minors. This measure was meant to cripple the church and allow for its collapse. All theological schools were closed as well as all monasteries and convents eventually. With the eradication of the church's legal status, the laity of the Russian Orthodox Church increasingly gained control over the parishes, which led to some conflicts between the laity and clergy. The new government for the next few years launched a campaign to seize church property. Churches were closed and could be converted to other uses, such as warehouses. This order to seize property was carried out with ruthless violence by Red soldiers. They often opened fire on crowds that surrounded churches in an attempt to defend them and on religious processions in protest against church persecution. Thousands were killed in this way, especially in the spring of 1918. Shooting down of religious processions are well documented in Voronezh, Shask, and Tula. Patriarch Tikhon excommunicated the Soviet leadership on January 19, 1918 for conducting this campaign. In retaliation, the regime arrested and killed dozens of bishops, thousands of the lower clergy and monastics, and multitudes of laity. The seizing of church property over the next few years would be marked by a brutal campaign of violent terror. High-ranking Orthodox bishops issued reports that called for the Church to focus more on combating atheism among the Russian populace in 1918–1919. They also issued statements of concern over liturgical changes that were being carried out by priests.